You know the feeling. The roast comes out dry, though you paid good money for it. The cucumbers turn soft in the jar. Your throat gets raw at sundown, and all the fancy syrups in the cupboard do little but sweeten your mouth. The porch step turns slick in winter. The skillet turns gummy. The cutting board smells like onion and fish, though you scrubbed it twice. And all the while, that plain blue can of salt sits there like it has nothing left to teach anybody. I will tell you plainly, that is how a great many useful things get lost. Not because they stopped working, but because folks stopped being shown the reason behind them. And you are about to give up on the best thing you will ever have for want of something nobody taught you. My name is Elias Yoder. My people came over from the Palatinate in 1838, and we have worked the same Lancaster County ground ever since. I was raised among people who did not waste much, did not trust every shiny new answer, and did not throw away an old method just because somebody printed a colorful label and doubled the price. My grandfather taught me with a salt crock on the table and a patient voice. My mother knew what a handful of salt could do in a kitchen before breakfast. Esther still keeps it close, same as her mother did, because there are some plain things that earn their place over and over again. Now, before we go further, let me straighten out one foolish part of a title like this. Salt hacks were not usually banned by some sheriff with a paper in hand. Most of them were simply pushed aside, frowned at, or forgotten while people were sold something newer and dearer. And doctors do not bless every old saying just because it is old. Some old sayings were nonsense. But a surprising number of these salt ways hold up because they rest on something true. Salt changes water. That is the whole hinge of the matter. Almost everyone has this backward. They think salt is mainly there to make a thing taste salty. No, salt is a worker. It pulls moisture where you want it, holds moisture where you need it, slows spoilage in the right setting, lowers freezing temperature, lifts bitterness, adds friction for scrubbing, and helps plain food behave itself. Once you understand that, the whole shelf changes in front of your eyes. Quick word before I go further. The old methods my family uses, there is more of it than fits in any one video. I gathered the whole of it into a book at eliasyoder.com. The book is the long version. If you want it, it is there. I will not mention it again. So let us walk through these old salt uses the right way, one by one, and I will give you the reason with each one, because understanding keeps a man from making a mess of a good method. The first is the simplest, and maybe the one doctors would argue with least. If your throat is scratchy from dry air or a common cold, stir a half teaspoon of salt into a cup of warm water, gargle it, and spit it out. Do not swallow it like medicine, and do not make it stronger thinking more must be better. The reason is plain. Mild salt water can help loosen thick mucus and calm irritated tissue for a little while. It is comfort, not a miracle, and a man who promises you a miracle by the calendar is selling something. But used gently, it often gives honest relief. The impatient mistake is making it too salty. Too much salt can sting and leave your mouth feeling worse. Second, for a tender mouth after you bit your cheek or your gums are irritated, a mild, warm saltwater rinse can be useful. Swish it softly and spit it out. The reason is that a gentle saline rinse helps clean the area without the burn of harsh mouthwashes full of strong flavor and alcohol. But be gentle. If you have severe pain, swelling, fever, or something that is not settling down, that is doctor work, not kitchen work. Old wisdom knows its limits, and that humility is part of why old wisdom can still be trusted. Third, if your feet are plain tired after a day on concrete, in the garden, or on a shop floor, a warm basin with a little salt can make a fine soak. Not because salt is magic, but because warm water relaxes you, and the salt makes the water feel a touch fuller and cleaner on the skin. It is for comfort, not cure. Do not use very hot water, and do not use it on broken skin. The old folks knew the difference between easing a burden and pretending to fix what needs real care. Fourth, dry brining meat is one of the best kitchen uses salt ever had. Rub a measured amount of salt over a roast, chicken, or thick chop ahead of time and let it rest in the refrigerator. The reason is not that the salt seals juices like some people still say. It does something better. First, it draws a little moisture to the surface. Then that salty moisture gets pulled back in. That gives you better seasoning through the meat and helps it hold on to moisture more evenly when heat comes. The careless mistake is overdoing the salt or leaving it warm on the counter. Use a light hand, keep it cold, and give it time. Salt rewards patience. Fifth, when cucumbers, eggplant, shredded cabbage, or summer squash seem too wet, salt them lightly and let them sit before cooking. Then blot or drain the extra water. The reason is that salt pulls out some surface moisture, and less extra water means better browning, crisper slaw, and fried vegetables that do not turn limp in their own steam. The mistake here is forgetting the salt is still on there. If you salt first and season again later, without tasting, supper gets ruined for no good reason. Sixth, salt fermentation is one of the cleverest food ways our ancestors handed down. Cabbage for sauerkraut is the plain example. You shred it, salt it in the right proportion, work it until it gives up its own brine, then keep it under that brine while it ferments. The reason is not romance. Salt helps hold back the wrong microbes while the right lactic acid bacteria get their turn. That is why sauerkraut can become sour, stable, and useful without vinegar. But I will warn you here, as I would warn my own kin. Clean jars, the right amount of salt, and vegetables kept under brine matter greatly. This is not a place for guessing. Carelessness makes bad ferments. If the vegetables rise above the brine and sit exposed, they can spoil where the air reaches them, which is why the old crocks used weights and watchfulness. The good result comes from order, not luck. Seventh, a quick saltwater soak can keep cut apples or pears from browning too fast. Make the water weak. Dip the slices briefly, then rinse and use them. The reason is that a mild saline bath slows the browning reaction on the cut surface. It is useful when you are putting up a pie, packing lunch, or setting out a dish for company. The mistake is making the water too salty or soaking too long, because then you taste the trick instead of just getting the benefit. Eighth, beans are one place where modern kitchen talk got many people turned around. A lot of folks were told never to salt beans until the end, because salt makes them tough. In many cases, the opposite is closer to true. A salted soak can help beans cook up more evenly and keep the skins from bursting to pieces. The reason is that sodium changes how the skins behave in water. The mistake is thinking salt will rescue ancient beans that should have been cooked last year. Some beans are just old, and no trick can make them young again. Ninth, salt in boiling water for potatoes, pasta, and certain vegetables is not just for habit. When you salt the water reasonably, you begin seasoning the food from the start. The reason is simple. Food that gets its seasoning early tastes fuller and more settled than food dusted only at the table. The mistake is salting so heavily that the pot tastes like the sea. I do not care what a proud cook says. You are seasoning supper, not curing herring. 10th, before electric freezers were common, folks knew that salt and ice together could do what ice alone could not. In a hand-crank ice cream freezer, the salt lowers the freezing point around the canister, which helps the cream freeze properly. That is not a superstition. That is plain physical truth. The same idea works in a salty ice bath for chilling bottles or butter more quickly. But do not let that salt water get into the food. It belongs around the container, not in it. My grandfather used to say, salt and ice are like two mules pulling the same wagon. Separately, they do one amount of work. Together, they do more than most folks expect. 11th, if you have cast iron with stuck bits and do not want to strip it with harsh soap or gouge it with something foolish, Coarse salt, with a bit of oil, can make a fine scrub. The reason is that salt gives you enough grit to lift food without scraping the life out of the pan's surface. Then wipe it, rinse if needed, dry it well, and oil it lightly. The mistake is leaving water in cast iron and calling the rust a mystery. Iron likes to be dried on purpose. 12th, for a wooden cutting board that smells of onion, garlic, or fish, cut a lemon, sprinkle salt on the board, and rub. Then wash and dry the board standing up. The reason is twofold. The salt gives gentle abrasion, and the lemon helps lift odor and surface discoloration. But do not soak the board for a long spell. Wood swells, warps, and cracks when people treat it like a stone sink. Clean it, dry it, and let it breathe. 13th, salt can help with fresh spills if you catch them quickly. A good handful on a fresh red wine spill or greasy splash can absorb moisture and buy you time before the stain sets deeper. The reason is plain. Dry crystals pull liquid into themselves and keep it from spreading as fast. But listen to me here. Salt is first aid for the cloth, not the whole cure. You still have to blot properly and wash the thing according to the fabric. The mistake is leaving the spill to work overnight and thinking the chore finished itself. 14th, old kettles, coffee pots, and stained mugs often clean up well with salt and a cloth or sponge, sometimes with a little vinegar if the material allows it. The reason is that salt gives a mild scrub without the chemical perfume of many cleaners. It is especially handy on brown tea film and coffee residue. But know your surface. Soft finishes can scratch, and some metals do better with gentler handling. Scrub modestly. The world is full of people who ruin a thing by cleaning it too hard. 15th, copper and brass can often be brightened with salt and vinegar worked into a paste with flour. The reason is that the mild acid helps loosen tarnish, and the salt gives it bite. Then rinse and dry well. It works because tarnish is on the surface, not because you whispered an old wives' spell over the bowl. But always test a small spot first, and do not use rough treatment on a valuable piece without knowing what finish it has. Old methods work best in old hands, because old hands move carefully. 16th, a salt crust can be a beautiful way to cook certain foods, especially whole fish or small potatoes. You pack damp salt around the outside, bake it, and crack the crust away before eating. The reason is not that the salt floods the food. The crust traps moisture and cushions heat, so the inside cooks gently. The mistake is thinking every food needs this treatment. It is a specific tool, not a religion. And if you season the food heavily before burying it in salt, you may get more than you wanted. 17th, a short refrigerator brine for lean meats, like pork chops or chicken breasts, can be a very practical old solution when those cuts tend to dry out. Salt in measured water, kept cold for the proper time, can improve texture and seasoning. The reason is the same family truth as dry brining. Salt changes how muscle holds water. But this is another place where impatience and carelessness spoil the lesson. Too long in brine, and a delicate cut gets overly salty or oddly textured. Keep the proportions sensible. Keep the meat cold, and do not pretend rules do not matter. 18th, when winter lays a skim of ice on porch boards, stone steps, or a little walkway, salt can help break that bond. The reason is again that salt lowers the freezing point of water, so the ice softens and loosens. That can spare a fall, and I think that is a mercy. But use a thoughtful hand. Too much salt can be hard on concrete, on boots, on plants by the edge, and on the ground itself. This is for a slick patch that needs help, not for salting the whole earth out of impatience. Sweep first if you can. Breaking the crust mechanically and then using a little salt often does the job with less waste, and thrift is part of the method too. 19th, a small pinch of salt can steady bitterness in food. In greens, tomatoes, black coffee, or dark chocolate, a little salt can round sharp edges so the good flavor comes forward. The reason is not fancy. Salt changes how your tongue reads bitterness. That is why some things taste deeper, not merely saltier, after a careful pinch. The mistake is using this as a mask for poor ingredients or scorched cooking. Salt can balance flavor. It cannot make a burnt supper innocent. 20th, and maybe the most overlooked of all, salt teaches a household to measure. That is an old hack too, though it does not sound flashy enough for city people. Use salt by proportion, not by guessing mood. A weighed amount for fermentation, a measured spoon for brine, a modest pinch for a pan. The reason is that salt is powerful. In the right amount it helps. In the wrong amount it overwhelms. The old folks who were best with salt were not wild-eyed throwers. They were steady hands. They knew that thrift without measure turns into waste wearing a homespun coat. That may sound like a small lesson, but it reaches into almost every room of a house. The old way was never merely to keep a cheap ingredient on hand. It was to know what that ingredient truly does. So you are not bullied by confusion every time a problem shows up in a new shirt. Now let me give you the warnings plain, because this is where good methods get blamed for bad behavior. Do not make salt stronger than needed just because you are in a hurry. Do not turn comfort into cure and pretend a gargle replaces real care when something is serious. Do not ferment by vague memory. Measure it. Do not brine meat warm. Keep it cold. Do not pour salt all over your steps and garden because you like quick results. Use only what the task calls for. Do not scrub every pretty metal bowl like you are grinding an axle. Know the material first. And if you have been told to limit sodium for a medical reason, listen to the physician who knows your case. Old ways are good servants and bad idols. They help most when they stay inside the bounds of sense. And now we come to the part people feel in their bones even when they do not say it aloud. Who profits when a family forgets what a plain can of salt can do? I am not telling you a man schemed this in a back room. No one had to. It is worse than a conspiracy, because it is a system nobody had to coordinate. It simply pays better to sell the expensive failing product than to teach a man to do it for free. It pays better to sell a throat syrup than to explain when a simple gargle gives honest comfort. It pays better to sell a special pan scrubber, odor remover, tarnish cream, produce wash, stain stick, and de-icer than to remind a household that one humble mineral already handles half those chores when used with understanding. That is not rage talking. That is just a sad little arithmetic of modern life. A household that knows a few first principles, buys less in panic, and throws away less in confusion. And there is not much profit in teaching calm competence. There is more profit in keeping a man doubtful about his own pantry. A thing that cannot be patented, branded fancy, and sold dear gets called old-fashioned, and then one day somebody rediscovers it, changes the label, and sells it back with a modern promise. So let us gather the whole lesson in a few plain sentences. Salt is not a miracle powder, and I will not insult you by pretending it is. It is a humble tool that works by changing water, moisture, temperature, friction, and flavor. Use it mildly for a gargle or mouth rinse and spit it out. Use it with measure to dry brine meat, soak beans, salt vegetables, ferment cabbage, or keep cut fruit from browning too fast. Use it with ice to freeze or chill more effectively. Use it as a gentle scrub on cast iron, boards, pots, copper, and brass when the surface allows it. Use it carefully on icy spots and carefully in cooking to draw out the best in food. In every case, measure beats guessing, patience beats force, and understanding beats hype. Now I would like to hear from you, and I mean that. Tell me in the comments what county you are watching from, what kind of kitchen work or home remedy you still trust salt for, and who first taught it to you. If you keep cast iron, tell me what pan has been with you the longest. If you garden, tell me what you are putting by this year. If you cook beans, tell me whether you were taught to salt early or late. If you have always thought you were doing something wrong with brining, browning, pickling, or winter steps, tell me that too. I read every one, and I learn the whole country from these comments. That is the truth. A man down in Georgia, a widow in Iowa, a retired mechanic in Maine, a grandmother in New Mexico, all of you together make a kind of front porch that the world badly needs. And if there is somebody in your family or church or town who still believes honest, practical knowledge ought to be passed hand to hand instead of hidden behind labels and prices, share this with them. Let them know there is still a place where plain things are spoken plainly. In the next one, I am going to show you an old kitchen and cellar trick that keeps onions, potatoes, and apples from spoiling one another before their time, and the whole secret comes down to where you set them and what not to store together. Most folks lose more food to bad placement than bad produce, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is enough for today. The older I get, the more I believe self-reliance is not really about pride. It is about remembering that the people who built this country with their hands were not waiting for a plastic bottle and a television promise to rescue them. They looked at what was already in reach and learned its character deeply enough to make a life with it, which is a kind of wisdom our times are starving for. They learned the character of plain things. They passed it on at the table, in the garden, by the stove, and out on the porch at dusk. If we keep even a little of that alive, then our children inherit more than tricks. They inherit steadiness. They inherit memory. And in a restless age, that is no small gift.